Hi guys, thank you so much for purchasing the SOS Digital Exam Aid for International Econ. All your money does go to support international development projects in Latin America. And the way that we're going to format this digital exam aid is to first go over chapters 1 to 3 really basically, because it's just kind of like the basis to understanding macroeconomics. And then we will have all the chapter videos from Greg that teaches you the chapter contents from the textbook. And then we're going to go a little bit further beyond, because in Hossein's lectures he does kind of go beyond just the textbook. So we're going to go over some of Hossein's examples that he did in class and on the midterm, and also in our assignment, that are probably applicable for you on your midterm. And then with all that, I feel like you should be pretty ready for your international economics exam. So I'm going to start off with a really brief intro to chapter 1 to 3, which wasn't actually overly tested on our midterm. There were actually 0 questions last year in 2014 in the short answer portion, but there are about like 5 multiple choice questions. But anyway, like let this serve as like a refresher of your memory for microeconomics. So chapter 1 in the textbook is what is economics? And it is basically an introduction to economics. What it is a social science that deals with choices regarding incentives and scarcity. And we will talk more about that when we talk about opportunity cost in chapter 2. So it basically defines that, and it also tells you about the difference between microeconomics and macroeconomics. Microeconomics involves individuals, households, and also businesses, and then macroeconomics involves the global environment, the international landscape. So that's the 2 differences. And then it goes on to talk about the 3 major economic questions, which is what to produce, how do we produce it, and for whom do we produce for. And what to produce, basically guns or butter, labor intensive stuff, capital intensive stuff. How do we decide what we make, how to produce it? So this kind of deals with the factors of production. And there are 4 types listed in your book: land, labor, capital, and it also talks about entrepreneurship, which is a little bit entrepreneurship. The last part is for whom, and that deals with the income that you make, and that also ties back to the factors of production, because when you think of for whom, who's going to purchase all these items? Land, people make rent off of it, that is their income. Labor, wages. Capital, interest. And lastly, entrepreneurship is profit. So if you remember these, you sort of understand the architecture, the framework for what economics is. And after that you can go on to read about economics as a social science. I think it talks about self-interest, social interest, and talks about global warming and technology and stuff like that. So if you're interested in that, you can read about it, but I'm going to say it's highly unlikely that it'll be tested on your midterm. Like, what are your thoughts on economics pertaining to, information technology? So you can feel free to read about that if you want, but that is the end of chapter 1. So chapter 2 talks about the economic problem, which is scarcity. And the best way to illustrate this is with the production possibilities frontier, because it really effectively explains what trade-offs are between 2, let's say, hypothetically in an economy, if you have just 2 items, and also effectively explains what opportunity cost is. So in this example, if we have butter on the y-axis and guns on the x-axis, and we want to produce at our most efficient outcome in our economy, we want to be producing on the PPF line. as you know, and anything below it would be an inefficient allocation of your resources. So not using what the textbook calls allocative efficiency and fully employing all your factors of production, so land, labor, capital. And anything beyond this is something that your economy cannot reach at the current rate it has. So you have to expand your technology or increase your factors of production in order to reach this. So in terms of trade-offs, you can see that if we produce more butter, then we have to produce less guns because we have scarcity, limited resources. So let's say if you want to produce 10 sticks of butter, you can produce 0 guns. And then over here, let's say you want to produce, pretend this is 8 sticks of butter, it goes to 2 guns. And so that would be the economic trade-off. And alternately, you can also look at this as opportunity cost. And to illustrate opportunity cost on the PPF, you can see that, for instance, 1 gun costs, let's say this is 13 sticks of butter to make, and in order to make another gun, so from this point, moving to this point, to make 2 guns, 1 more gun, we have to sacrifice 13 to 10. 3 sticks of butter. So opportunity cost can be expressed as a ratio or y over x. So in this case, in order to make 1 more gun, it would be 3 over 1. So you sacrifice 3 sticks of butter, and that's your opportunity cost. And inversely, for butter, it would be 1 over 3 guns. And it's always the inverse for the opportunity cost. And that basically explains the PPF and scarcity involving opportunity cost and trade-offs. The next part of the chapter talks about the PPF in relation to marginal benefit and marginal cost. And this falls under the concept of allocative efficiency, which we've already talked about. And the concepts are pretty similar. So marginal cost, it talks about increasing marginal cost. So when you produce more and more, the marginal cost is the amount it costs you to produce every additional unit, and it is increasing because when you get to the point where let's say you run out of factors of production, everything will get increasingly more expensive to produce every single additional unit, which is why marginal cost is increasing. And also talks about marginal benefit. That's the amount of benefit you derive from producing, or rather consuming, every additional unit. So same thing sort of applies. The more that you consume, the less your benefit is. And so on the graphs, their individual graphs, they're actually quite opposite. So for marginal cost, it would look like this, because every additional thing it's rising in cost, and marginal benefit is like this. So it's the other way around, because with every additional thing that you're consuming, it is lowering, or lowering in value for the benefit that you're deriving. And that's just those 2 individual curves and concepts that you have to understand. The next part of the chapter talks about economic growth, and with this, I'm going to refer back to the PPF to explain it. And basically, I've drawn it again. And with economic growth, I already talked earlier about trying to produce on the frontier, the PPF frontier, because this means the most allocative efficiency of your resources and your factors of production. And we can't get past here because we don't have the resources to produce that. So how do we grow to produce at, let's say, this point? And there's 2 ways. And so the first way is technological growth, as I mentioned before, and the second way is an increase in your factors of production. So there's 2 things that Hossein actually talks about a lot in class, and one is endogenous variables and the other is exogenous variables. And so with endogenous variables, that means there are movements on the curve. So say from here to here or here to here, that means you're allocating more towards guns or more towards butter. That's endogenous movement. That's not growth. However, endogenous movement is an increase in the factors of production. So let's say since guns are capital intensive, an increase in K capital would perhaps move your production function outwards. And then in that case, maybe you'll be able to produce here. So those are the two ways. The last part of this chapter is comparative advantage versus absolute advantage. And what you have to know about these two concepts is that absolute advantage is, think, quantity. They describe it as being more productive, so it's like the more, with the same amount of time, who can produce more. That's productivity, efficiency. And that's how you measure absolute advantage. And the difference is comparative advantage measures with opportunity cost. So for a comparative advantage, I've created an example with two hypothetical people, person A, person B, 1 hour, the same amount of time. Person A can produce 5 guns and 5 sticks of butter. Person B, 20 guns and 10 sticks of butter. So it's apparent that person B obviously has the absolute advantage with more quantity in the same amount of time. It's more productive. However, for comparative advantage, we have to calculate opportunity cost. So this would be the opportunity cost for one stick of butter, and that would be 2. And then in this case, 1 stick of butter is 1. So person A has the lower opportunity cost, therefore they have the comparative advantage in producing butter. It's a more efficient allocation of their time versus person B, although they produce more, although they still produce more butter. So you have to watch out for opportunity costs. And the last part of the chapter just talks about gains from trade. So if you are producing at your competitive advantage, and so is a different country, if you guys are trading, you guys will see gains from trade, and the more efficient allocation of your products with regard to your competitive advantage will result in more overall products for each country when you do trade. And that would be the end of chapter 2. Now, chapter 3 is just explaining demand and supply. And so chapter 3 goes over the law of supply and demand. So we're going to start with demand, and then we're going to put it together in the end. So the demand curve looks like this. And then the question is why a higher price reduces the quantity demanded. And there is 2 reasons. And the first one is called the substitution effect. And the second one is called the income effect. So that means, and so the substitution effect is basically when the price of the good rises and it's really high, then the consumer will substitute its purchase for that item for another item that will be its substitute. So an example would be substituting margarine for butter, or rather butter for margarine, because butter is more expensive. Second one is income effect. So now we're going to talk about changes on the demand curve, and there are 2 major changes. One would just be movements on the demand curve from, like, let's say A to B, and this would be, this would just be a price change. So if this was the demand curve for butter, if the price of butter, dropped, then that would be the movement. Alternately, you have a shift in the demand curve, and that would be, let's say, demand of butter increased, and there are numerous reasons for that, but the textbook lists a couple. Prices of related goods, for example, the cost of a substitute good for, let's say, margarine increases in cost, and because of that, it's more expensive, people will go to buy butter more, and that's why the demand for butter will increase. That's an example. Another one is expected future prices. If expected future price of butter is supposed to go up, people will buy it now. Demand will increase. It will shift up like this. Another one would be income, also expected future income and credit. This is population and preferences, and I guess you can read about those. There's really a lot of different reasons. And then, so the difference, they want to illustrate change in quantity demanded, price factor, anything else, non-price factor, like some of the reasons, or all the reasons I listed earlier. And so now we're going to talk about supply. It's on the same graph, but it looks like this. And the reason why the supply curve looks like this is because the higher the price of the good, the greater the quantity that suppliers are willing to supply it, so greater the quantity supplied. And for the supply curve, also sort of same thing, supply, quantity supplied changes with the movement on the curve, and that is also a price factor. So again, if you're on the producer side, which is what I think about when I'm talking about supply, if you're a producer and the price increases of, let's say, butter, you're producing butter, then your quantity supplied will increase, and alternately the other way around. And if there is a shift, exogenous factors, and some of the reasons are prices of factors of production, let's say an input. So for butter, it would be the cost of, let's say, milk to create butter. If that increases, then this supply will go down because, will lessen, sorry. That's moving to right, moves to left, that means supply will lessen because the cost of milk is higher. Another one is prices of related goods, like substitute goods, expected future prices, number of suppliers, technology, and the state of nature, for example, like a natural disaster or something like that. And to finally illustrate supply and demand together, I'm going to do an example. Because the most important thing is understanding both of them together and the difference between the shifts and also the movements. So let's say you are in the butter industry and the price of milk, which is an input, increases. What happens? So what happens is supply decreases, and this is a shift because it is a non-price factor. It is the price of the input of milk. So this is new supply over here. So the supply, in this case, decreases, and the quantity demanded also decreases. So there's a difference between demand and quantity demanded. The demand doesn't decrease, the quantity demanded decreases, as well as the supply itself. And another example, let's say, same industry, butter industry, the demand, or rather, sorry, the price of margarine drops. So in that case, price of margarine drops, there will be less demand because people are moving towards margarine, and that is a non-price factor. So therefore, there will be a shift to the left on the demand curve, and alternately quantity supplied will decrease because with this the price will decrease, which subsequently results in the quantity supply decreasing. And those are, I think, probably the most important parts of chapters 1 to 3.